We've probably all witnessed the current two-tiered approach to policing on the streets of the UK at the moment. I think probably all of us in this room and those watching on the internet are aware of the topic. A couple of examples: the Muslim protesters in Leeds who were seen rioting without significant police intervention, while native British protesters often find themselves detained and behind bars in hours after arrest. And of course there's the now regular disorder at the Notting Hill Carnival every August, with displays of widespread disorder, public order violations and serious criminal activity, sometimes including murder, very sadly. In 2020, of course, the anti-lockdown protesters were swiftly arrested and penalised under COVID laws, while Black Lives Matter protesters were allowed to march freely, dressed in black uniform, while performing Black Power salutes. This not only violated COVID regulations, but also breached public order laws. But I'm going to refrain from speaking any further on the two-tiered approach that we've seen recently. Everybody here is aware of what is happening. The topic I'm going to explore instead is the root of this discriminatory policing and how and why we have a two-tiered approach to policing. In my judgment, much of it can be traced back to a lengthy report that was published in February 1999. To understand the significance of this report, we need to revisit July 31st, 1997, when the newly elected Home Secretary Jack Straw commissioned retired Judge Sir William MacPherson of Cluny to, and I quote, "inquire into the matters arising from the death of Stephen Lawrence, with a particular focus on identifying lessons for the investigation and prosecution of racially motivated crimes." The Labour government's unanimous acceptance of its findings, in my humble judgment, represent the catalyst of the current two-tiered policing system we have today. The following is a brief outline of the Stephen Lawrence case for those who don't know what happened. Around 10:30 p.m. on Thursday, April 22nd, 1993, two black teenagers, Stephen Lawrence and his friend Wayne Brooks, were at a bus stop on Wellhall Road in London. While waiting at the bus stop, Lawrence and Brooks were attacked by a group of white youths. The assault, which lasted approximately 15 to 20 seconds, resulted in Lawrence being fatally stabbed, while Brooks managed to escape unharmed. Obviously, such a brutal assault has to be fundamentally condemned. And I should mention that I'm not exploring the legalities of the case itself. I'm seeking to understand the fundamental importance of the MacPherson Report in relation to its impact on UK policing. Although universally accepted by ministers, politicians and the press, MacPherson's findings have luckily been criticised. One critique came from a lecturer in Russian Studies at the University of Leeds named Dr. Frank Ellis, who published a pamphlet, The MacPherson Report, Anti-Racist Hysteria and the Sovietisation of the United Kingdom. And I cite this essay frequently here in my speech. MacPherson, very early in his report, which I've recently reread, established that Lawrence was murdered solely on racist motivations. To quote MacPherson from paragraph 1.11, Stephen Lawrence's murder was simply and solely and unequivocally motivated by racism. There are two serious flaws in the MacPherson Report that resonate throughout the document. Firstly, that racism is the sole preserve of white people, and secondly, that racism was the catalyst of Lawrence's murder. We cannot discount racism as a motivating factor of the killing, but simultaneously we cannot adopt it as gospel either. The motive will probably never be uncovered. Nonetheless, MacPherson had prematurely reached his conclusion before finalising his report. To quote John Upton from the London Review of Books, the fact that the inquiry did not consider it necessary to hear from the Lawrences or the Brooks suggests that it had already drawn its conclusions before considering the evidence before it. To continue the theme, here's MacPherson again, this time from paragraph 4.9. Any protestation that Mr. and Mrs. Lawrence's attitude stems from perception and not reality must be abandoned. But in racist murder and pressure group politics, Norman Dennis, Jules Erdos and Ahmed Al-Shahi cite on page 21 of their report, and I quote, "At the time of the MacPherson inquiry, Mrs. Doreen Lawrence was aged 46 and she lived in England since she was 9. She said, I personally have never had any racism directed at me. There was something I felt on the outskirts, but nobody ever directly approached me and was racist towards me. Because of how we lived as a family, we got on with people. Our immediate next door neighbour were a white family, and we got on with them very well. The children were the same age as my children. We lived in each other's houses and we had no problems." MacPherson later asserts that Stephen Lawrence's friend, Dwayne Brooks, was ignored and neglected by the police shortly after the attack. MacPherson believes this to be evidence of police racism. As MacPherson contends in paragraph 5.31, "We do not believe that a young white man in a similar position would have been dealt with in the same way." MacPherson presents no evidence of this charge and doesn't explain why black people and white people are treated differently in similar circumstances in the immediate aftermath of a murder. Could the police have shunned Brooks because he used offensive and reprehensible language when addressing them and when referring to them? To quote Frank Ellis, "Why are we to believe that a young white man who called the police at the scene of a murder and who behaved in an aggressive manner would not have been treated in this way?" Ladies and gentlemen, please take note of the following two sentences, just 24 words. These two sentences may be the most critical in MacPherson's report, highlighting how we've ended up with a two-tiered policing structure here in 2024. And I quote from paragraph 45.24 of the MacPherson Report. "Colourblind policing must be outlawed. The police must deliver a service which recognises the different experiences, perceptions and needs of a diverse society." I intend to return to this statement shortly. Ironically, MacPherson criticises the police for treating black people differently, but simultaneously instructs them to treat black people differently. Cognitive dissonance there, I think, ladies and gentlemen. In other words, what MacPherson believes is that the Metropolitan Police Force, in fact all UK police forces, are institutionally racist. What utter nonsense. How can an individual responsible for the collective guilt be responsible for the collective guilt of an entire institution? To quote Dr. Ellis, "First, the notion that any sane individual can be guilty of something but be unconscious thereof is a rather odd idea to find in Britain, but not in the former Soviet Union or communist China." The anti-racist guru, let's call him, Robin Oakley, in paragraph 6.31 of the MacPherson Report, contrives, and I quote, "It could be said that institutional racism in this sense is in fact pervasive throughout the culture and institutions of British society and is in no way specific to the police force." Unashamedly, MacPherson criticised an experienced police officer, Detective Sergeant Davidson, who worked on the Lawrence case. MacPherson was swift to discount Davidson's professional opinion about the killers when he made the following case, and I quote this from paragraph 19.34. "Because these lads had attacked whites before, very similarly, with a similar knife, I believe that this was thugs. They were described as the Krays. They were thugs who were out to kill, not particularly a black person, but anybody. And I believe that to this day that this was thugs, not racism, just pure, bloody-minded thuggery." Many of the police officers involved in the Lawrence case held this view. However, MacPherson dismissed it, instead embracing the stance that the attack was motivated solely and entirely by racism. In his critique of D.S. Davidson and other sceptical detectives and officers, MacPherson labels them as guilty of racism. And how could they ever defend themselves? They were accused of institutional, unconscious racism, a charge they were obviously unable to refute. Dr. Ellis contends, and I quote, MacPherson refuses significantly to acknowledge the fact that the alleged suspects were also implicated in the stabbing of two white youths, Stacey Benfield and Lee Pearson. I find the views expressed by D.S. Davidson that those who killed Stephen Lawrence would have been just as willing to kill a white very persuasive. It is a credit to this officer that he, unlike some of his superiors, refused to allow himself to be intimidated and browbeaten when cross-examined by Mr. Mansfield QC. To quote Sky News on David Norris, who, prior to being accused of Stephen's murder, stood trial for the attempted murder of Stacey Benfield. I quote, Norris was found not guilty of stabbing a young white man, Stacey Benfield, in the chest with a miniature sword after a row on an Eltham street. Unquote. This young lad was white, and he could have easily, very easily, died in that attack. The MacPherson Report was not commissioned by the New Labour government to independently assess the Lawrence case. Instead, it was sheer intimidation, it was ugly and pervasive. Dr. Ellis sums it up well, and I quote, some of the recommendations from a total of 70 in all go way beyond the confines of policing. Indeed, some represent a serious threat to civil liberties and free speech in the United Kingdom. Don't they just? It's been more than 30 years since Stephen Lawrence was murdered, and 25 years since Sir William MacPherson published his damaging and degrading report. And we're now witnessing the intimidation, the civil liberties violations, the victimisation of native Britons that Dr. Frank Ellis predicted in that essay. Pardon me. I've spoken on the following subject at a previous British Democrat meeting where in communist countries the police often serve as an extension of the ruling elite, prioritising the protection and preservation of the state and its ideology over traditional law enforcement duties. This alignment with the elite's interests can lead to a policing approach that downplays or even ignores common crimes like robbery, assault, etc., instead of focusing on crimes that are perceived as threats to the state. Think of Orwell's classic novel 1984. Winston Smith is doggedly pursued by Big Brother for daring to challenge the state apparatus, while the proletariat are left unconstrained and autonomous. In 21st century Britain, our elites are not interested in traditional criminal misdemeanour. Whereas if you criticise them on X or Facebook or in protest on the streets of our country, they then feel threatened. If you criticise trans ideology or Islam or immigration, expect a knock at the door from the local police constabulary, burgle someone's property, and the same police force won't even bother to record it as an offence. In summary, in communist countries, the police often reflect the interest of the ruling elite by prioritising the suppression of political crimes over traditional crimes. This focus on protecting the state and its ideology often leads to the neglect of ordinary law enforcement duties, as the regime's stability and continuity are placed above public safety. And that is what is starting to happen here in this country. And why? Where does this apparent shift in policing emanate from? Let's once again, ladies and gentlemen, return to the MacPherson Report. Of the 70 recommendations that MacPherson advocates, it's the following one that has led to the two-tier policing spectacle. Again, I quote from the MacPherson Report. A racist incident is any incident which is perceived to be racist by the victim or any other person. And that's quoted from recommendation 12. I said earlier that I would return to this statement. I'm going to read it again. It's from paragraph 45.24. the police must deliver a service which recognises the different experiences, perceptions and needs of a diverse society. In other words, a two-tiered policing approach where native Britons are excluded from an incident which they feel is racially motivated. In fact, not just Britons, but all white people. So when you hear of so-called non-crime hate incidents, perceived offences which are motivated by hate but are not actual criminal offences, you have William MacPherson to thank. We really are in Orwellian territory, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, to quote Dr. Ellis in this lengthy quote, Recommendation 13 goes so far to say that the term racist incident must be understood to include crimes and non-crimes in policing terms. The concept of a non-crime, a word that surely belongs to the dictionary of doublethink, represents the criminalising of everything, so as to justify police intrusion into every aspect of our lives. At this point, one must ask whether we should reject multiculturalism and all its works outright, if such draconian recommendations against the indigenous white population have to be enacted in order to ensure the success of the multicultural experiment. This policy opens the door for every malicious, envious or vindictive individual to stir up trouble. People who in the days of the Soviet Union or Stasi-controlled East Germany would report their neighbours for criticising figures like Stalin, either to gain personal advantage or to settle some real or even imagined grievance. We should ask ourselves if we truly want to live in a society where every word must be carefully considered before speaking, where all genuine spontaneity in conversation disappears, and we're left with only rehearsed phrases and state-approved slogans. In such a society, people would fall silent, fearing that anything they might say could be used against them by thought police or self-appointed enforcers of so-called hate crimes. The MacPherson definition of racism isn't just a threat to free speech, it's a threat to speech itself, one of humanity's most powerful faculties. Is this the future we want? Sadly, I believe it's the present that we've got. The commentator Konstantin Kisin recently said in an interview, and I quote, "In Russia last year, 400 people were arrested for things they said on social media. In Britain, that figure was 3,300. Has anybody here heard of Chelsea Russell? No. In 2017, Chelsea Russell, a teenager from Liverpool, honoured a 13-year-old friend who tragically died in a car accident by posting a tribute on her Instagram profile. She included a quote from the rap song I'm Trippin' by Snapdog, along with the words R.I.P. Frankie Murphy. A year later, Russell's Instagram profile caught the attention of the police, and it led to her arrest and subsequent charges. The lyrics she quoted, I'm going to quote, "Kill a snitch nigger, rob a rich nigger," were deemed grossly offensive in court, resulting in her conviction for a hate crime. This was a young girl, a child, who was merely commemorating the death of her friend. My guess is that most of us here, maybe with the exception of Jim, have never heard of Snapdog and would probably never listen to such music. But should repeating the lyrics of a song lead to criminalisation? And why was she convicted? Because of MacPherson's recommendations. To repeat recommendation 13, and I quote, "The term racist incident must be understood to include crimes and non-crimes in policing terms. Both must be reported, recorded and investigated with equal commitment." Recommendation 14 states that the definition of a racist incident be universally adopted by police, local government and other relevant agencies. So when, as has happened recently, we see a legal trend of imprisoning people for Twitter and Facebook and other social media posts, sometimes for a year, sometimes for 18 months, the reason for this draconian measure is the MacPherson Report. And this happens at a time when we are releasing real criminals, perhaps to make way for all the non-criminals or thought criminals posting hurty words on Twitter. Another comment on the MacPherson Report, where again I draw on Dr. Ellis, and I quote, "Any doubts, however, about the Orwellian provisions of the MacPherson Report should be completely dispelled by Recommendation 39, which states that consideration should be given to amendment of the law to allow prosecution of offences involving racist language or behaviour to have taken place otherwise than in a public place." This is simply put the sacrifice of privacy. Think of the Scottish hate crime bill that sought to prosecute people for egregious comments made in the privacy of their own homes. Where did the SNP draw their inspiration? The MacPherson Report. The defining feature of the Soviet Union was the use of violence to crush any opposition. It is important to recognise that once a society has been shattered and traumatised by violence, the mere threat of violence along with targeted terror can be enough to keep the ruling party in power, though not indefinitely. Social engineers in the West who once admired the Soviet Union have so far been unable to replicate the routine violence of communist regimes, though they often praise it from a distance. Instead, they have studied and refined methods of control, understanding the importance of dominating the judiciary, the universities and government institutions, thereby circumventing the democratic process. This is where we observe the process of Sovietisation. I wonder if there is a troubling parallel at play here that is yet to unfold. The Soviet Union eventually gave way to rigid and oppressive bureaucracy. Are we in Britain experiencing this process? The MacPherson Report is one of the most dangerous and pervasive instruments of oppression to be published and enacted in British history. So when you see two-tiered policing on our streets, it is that report that is responsible. We need to clear out our politicians and fight to have MacPherson's recommendations repealed. But it will be a struggle, it will be a fight. But we're British people. We're accustomed to a fight and we don't back down. In fact, we embrace a fight and our country is worth fighting for. And these politicians who've led the cultural Marxist revolution need to be cleared out. We find ourselves in a time when politicians are not held in high esteem. It's frustrating to observe the damage they're doing to our country. And I understand that frustration. I'm as frustrated as everybody in this room. Politicians are often seen as experts in words, but not in deeds. I hear your call for decisive action to get the police policing the crimes that matter: burglary, robbery, theft, fraud and violence. But reform needs to come from our politicians. Britain's survival depends on it. Our nation possesses immense potential, intellect, talent, craftsmanship and unmatched skills. These are the trademarks of the British people. And we need people like you, bold and brave, to replace the squalid and sordid, spurious politicians in Westminster. Britain's survival depends on energy and action, qualities that are not present in our Parliament at the moment. But things are changing. The British public is waking up, and I look forward to a day when we replace these bogus parliamentarians with real patriotic, bold and determined and courageous people like us. Thank you.